And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the President for his attendance here at this event on behalf of Dóchas. I think for those of us who care about these kind of issues, who care about the issues that are central to the Sustainable Development Goals, whether they be environmental or educational or about tackling poverty and hunger, it's crucial that we have people like the President of our own country here and listening to what you have to say and also showing to us how much he cares about these issues. And it's significant that we have people in his position involved at this level. So let me hand you over to the President, Michael D. Higgins.
Dear friends, as it is part of development integrity itself, let me start in our own language. A cordia goelis, yatsanatomar kutori derin is muren, fleisharam ven shalyub, egan kogol tovkas sha askeltagus is minlam weekas agwol, le Dóchas as an okkarja ostyle, agus akkohere heleur gahirlak Charlotte Kelly. Dear friends, it is a very great pleasure to be opening this important conference, which tackles the most fundamental challenge facing all of the nations on earth at present, namely that of achieving the change in policy structures and indeed behaviours that will enable us to fully implement the new universally applicable framework for global development. I do want to thank Dóchas for hosting this event and your chairperson, Sharon Kelly, for her warm words of welcome. Let me respond in kind and congratulate Dóchas for their determination to galvanise attention in Ireland on the crucial significance of global sustainable development for the future of humanity. I also want to say how pleased I am that there are so many people from the international institutions attending your sessions, which will be very valuable. But Dóchas and its member organisations, they have played a leading role in highlighting the importance of these issues over the past few years, and I hope you will consider my speech today as an encouragement to carry on with your good work and to identify possibilities to do even more. I'm also working, this is instalment 1, I'm also working on a second instalment which will be my speech in Istanbul at the Global Humanitarian Summit. But today, the timing of today's conference is very appropriate. At the beginning of last year, when I addressed a similar audience of Irish NGOs at the launch of the European Year of Development in Dublin, I suggested that the international community was called upon to take crucial decisions that would shape our lives together on what I call this fragile planet for decades to come, and in the interest of future generations as well as present generations. 2 of those crucial decisions were taken, first on global sustainable development in September in New York, and then on global climate change in December in Paris, making 2015 a milestone on the path towards a more just and sustainable world. I think it will be remembered, I believe, as a year when the nations of the world renewed their commitment to eradicating poverty and hunger in poorer countries, while also addressing problems of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production in the richer world. This morning I was looking at figures on those who are suffering from acute hunger, 0.8 of a billion, but also double the numbers of suffering from gross hunger and the number of people suffering from malnutrition. At the same time as by 2050, it looks like 50% of the world's population will be overweight. So you have these contradictions indeed. But I think that we are now in 2016 and we're at another crucial and perhaps more difficult phase, the phase of implementation, of turning words into action. So the question is, how can we keep the momentum that was there going? And how do we retain the public interest in these issues that we've been discussing? How can we keep up the tempo of diplomatic activity, which was so successful, and the exchange of information, which began, but which has a great journey to go. How do we get, in short, from words and promises to actual change? In a challenging context of population growth, unprecedented levels of migration, worrying levels of conflict, and political instability in so many regions of the world. And even this morning, as I was reading recent developments, turning words into action has such a, when you think, for example, of the journey from pledges to actual arrival of the necessary fundings that are necessary. I think, for example, the cost of IDPs, which was allocated of 446 million, 13% of which has arrived. And then again, too, of the actual practical effect of that on the cuts on the daily vouchers of Syrian refugees, half of whom receive nothing, and another half have been reduced very significantly because of the failure to turn a pledge into an actual delivery in terms of commitment. This issue of words into action is really what I really want to speak about, but also wanted to address rather frankly some of the issues that are slipping away. I want to say too as well that there's one myth we need to get rid of, and that is that those of us who draw attention to what isn't being discussed are somehow or another not people who are engaged with empiricism. Empiricism is about looking at all of the facts, and you therefore must address that myth and say to yourself, well, you must look, those of you who are making the strong case for what you call pragmatism, you must look at the consequences of what it is you're refusing to look at empirically. We are all empiricists, and we are not lesser empiricists because we have a normative purpose to our investigations or our concerns. And in my address today, I'd like to suggest that the necessary change in international development policy requires no less than a shift in paradigm, a radical rethink of the theoretical models that have informed international policy in such areas as trade, aid, or debt for the last few decades. Now, this is a task for our scholars as well as for our diplomats and policymakers at national, international, and multilateral level. But it is also a shift to which non-governmental organizations can contribute, I believe, in a most significant way. It is indeed my profound conviction that each and every one of the NGOs represented here this afternoon can play a part in fostering what is necessary. That is a transformative approach to global sustainable development and global social justice. Now, before I develop this point, may I reflect for a moment just on the significance of the new and universal framework for sustainable development that was adopted in last September at the United Nations headquarters in New York. I had the pleasure of attending that summit, which saw one of the largest ever gatherings of world leaders recognize the need for a redefinition of the very notion of development as it had been understood previously. In other occasions and in other places, I've taken up the strong statements of Gilbert Rist on the very concept of development itself, but just sticking to development as it is used and invoked in practice at the present time. To achieve what was achieved in New York, traditional mindsets had to be set aside to achieve this seminal advance in multilateral diplomacy. The new Sustainable Development Goals, they are universal, they apply to all countries, and not anymore primarily to those labelled developing or poor. They go beyond previous dichotomies in public discourse too, between North and South. This is as it must be, because after all, we have in the so-called North levels of poverty, unemployment, and exclusion that point to what I have called a South and the North. And while conversely, many features associated with the industrial North have migrated to the South. That is, there have been aspects of development which have flown through elites in the South, which have given them and led them to claim characteristics of the overconsumption of the North. But it has not been disseminated to the population generally. In fact, one of the basic premises of the new framework for sustainable development is that all countries are inherently unfinished projects. No country is ever fully developed. All of them are developing countries, continuously transforming and seeking new ways to respond adequately to fluctuating global circumstances and to the fundamental challenge at the heart of every society, that of guaranteeing the well-being, flourishing and full participation of all its citizens, both for today and in the future. Again, another empirical proof of this is the flow of acute poverty. Whereas, if you looked at the figures 15 years ago, they're located in the least developing countries. They now have, in fact, large sections of poverty have flown to middle countries. So therefore, this question about why there is a real meaning to this phrase, universal, affecting as it does all populations. The new 2030 agenda provides a comprehensive blueprint for an integrated continuum of action at international and national levels, stretching from the necessary response to emergency situations in the short term, to the need to empower vulnerable communities in the long term. Importantly, it insists that there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. For the first time at multilateral level, peace, political stability, and good government are recognized together with the economic, social, and environmental pillars as a virtual fourth pillar of development policy. On that question, when we look, for example, as I will, at migratory flows, and you look at what is the composition of the refugee population of the world, and you take five countries which have been the locations of, for example, in relation to those related to consequences of terrorism, 72% of those refugees are located to are in 5 countries. That raises other issues in relation to the adequacy and the integrity of diplomatic practice. It includes, for example, countries like Iraq and Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, obviously. But there are countries as well, for example, we can hardly consider the migratory flows that had been a consequence of Iraq without seriously looking at what actions took place in Iraq and how and why and for what purpose. The challenge now is to act on all these words that were used in New York and all these words and all these sentiments we invoked in Paris. I think it is to ensure that action follows the principles to which governments didn't just commit the heads of state, but which they committed their people, their institutions, and their politics. But that is where the non-governmental organisations have a crucial part to play. I think that we can all rejoice at the fact that both the climate and the development agendas have attracted huge public interest in all our countries. And we can be further pleased that in a way the young people are particularly interested, and so many of them are, if you like, at the forefront. The voluntary pledges made by all participating countries in Paris, for example, are public commitments which should allow civil societies to hold their governments to account more easily. As for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals agreed in New York that are fleshed out by 169 targets, as you know, they are, if you like, to be monitored through indicators, and the generation of those indicators can galvanize the participation of NGOs, concerned citizens and activists as they monitor their government's actions in combating, for example, poverty and hunger. Credible and transparent mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of the new development goals are fundamental to the 2030 agenda. They are still under discussion. Momentum in this important process must not be allowed to flag in the face of immediate crises, which is always a danger. Without clear indicators to monitor progress, there will be no way of holding governments to account for their policies. I very much hope, therefore, that all of you here will seize on these new indicators, ensure that they're widely disseminated and understood, and that you will, in other words, fully embrace this opportunity to boost democratic participation around the issue of development. I think that is very important. In doing so, you will face interesting choices, for example, is how are you to handle contradictions? You shouldn't be defeated by a contradiction, but you certainly shouldn't imagine that it doesn't exist. For example, I was looking recently at the change between the last 10 or 15 years again. There was a time when foreign direct investment was half the development flow, the total sum spent on development in the world. It is, last year, 5 times what is in fact actually the total amount of money spent on development. And that change in ratio between foreign direct investment and the total spending on development has come at a certain cost. There are countries such as, for example, Nigeria, which has about 80% of its taxation is from multinational corporations. So there's always the danger that, if you like, the location of the arrival of the foreign direct investment is conditional on taxation agreements that will deprive the receiving country of the capacity to put a taxation base in place, which in turn deprives it of the opportunity of addressing or moving towards its development goals. These are issues that I intend to develop much further when in Istanbul. But last September, too, in New York, I did meet a delegation of Dóchas representatives on the margin of the summit, and I took the opportunity to salute the strong role that civil society organizations had played throughout the various negotiation processes leading up to the adoption of the new goals. I think that such a concerted advocacy on the part of NGOs provides, I believe, a template for future international negotiations on matters of universal interest, and those coordinated efforts must now be sustained throughout the implementation phase. I also am intrigued by the argument that has occurred in some of the journalism around the development issue about, for example, that you had so many goals and that you had 169 targets. Well, there's something that isn't being stated as well, is that some of those who make the case for a lesser number that everyone could have addressed and so on, also have a kind of subtext to their argument, and that is that you should be satisfied for what you could achieve within the existing paradigm and within the existing models. And it would be much better if they were upfront about that. But I think, quite frankly, therefore, you have to say equally, it is like the argument in relation to those is that you must be willing to, no one is refusing to speak to anyone or to hear from anyone, but it is part of the discourse's integrity that the assumptions be placed on the table. In ensuring accountability, innovative tactical approaches may be taken up and tested. NGOs may consider, for example, if I may put forward a modest proposal, asking the prospective candidates for the post of Secretary General of the United Nations to state their approach to securing the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I had actually written this in my speech before I received this morning the report of the United Nations Association United Kingdom report, which is a splendid report, and it covers all of the field, and it includes the statements of the moderates as well. NGOs will be called upon, I think, to engage firmly with deep-rooted issues of cooperation and coordination that lie at the heart of international action, or indeed sometimes inaction, in the areas of development and climate. The new agenda for sustainable development recognises that effectively tackling interlinked challenges such as extreme poverty, climate change, subsistence farming, migration will require coherent policy responses across a variety of sectors. Without such policy coherence, we will not rise to the challenge that we've set ourselves. So here there is a real problem, a problem between states and a problem within states. I have already attempted to address in a number of speeches the fact that we sometimes are dealing with institutional silos that are not suitable for the achievement of universal goals in a global context. I spoke about this recently when I was in Geneva for the conference on debt management. The social development goals, you see, are a tapestry of goals and targets which have to be pursued together, making progress in one area dependent on progress in others, and requiring integrated and authentic policy responses. Now, this reflects not just the global and interrelated nature of the challenge of our times, but also the reality of people's lives. The fact that political, social, economic, and environmental dimensions are interrelated in our everyday experience. Now, while it's beyond the scope of my speech today, I'm mindful that the case, for example, at the highest level, for the reform of our multilateral system, in the face of an ever-growing body of evidence of failures to address the challenges of our time, is more pressing than ever. It is difficult for me to be optimistic that any radical reform of the United Nations will happen in the short term. I've been reading about it since the 1970s, when you had Brian Urquhart and Erskine Childers III writing brilliant books about how it is to be changed. And sometimes it gets worse, because some of the proposals for change are really proposals for cutting back on staff and, in fact, centralising agencies that needed even more to be on the ground. But I think we might at least hope that the critical issues of representation, coordination and cooperation will be considered in some depth in the course of the forthcoming process to select the next Secretary General. I know that a 1 for 7 billion campaign of the United Nations UK campaign it mentions this too. I congratulate them on it. And the hustings should, in fact, provide a space for that. In framing our responses too, greater coordination is required between different United Nations agencies, but also, of course, between different government departments and institutions at national level. Really, you cannot be saying on the one hand that you are considering that you are modernising your development strategy if another part of government is suggesting that you mustn't ask questions about tax agreements that are depriving receiving countries of the opportunity of setting up their economy. I think that effective implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, I've said, will require a broad and integrated domestic policy response involving a whole-of-government approach, as well as a deliberate and sustained outreach to a broad group of stakeholders, including, it goes without saying, the non-governmental sector. You know, you can be very simple about this in a way. You could ask the question, who is responsible for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals at government level? And you ask that in different countries. And some will say, the Minister for the Environment will have that, will be adding it to his or her responsibilities. But then you go across and you look at what I have said as well, the issue of tax, the issue, all the other issues, the issues of industrial policy, the issues, if you like, of non-tariff obstacles to the products of people from some of the countries anxious to break into the trade cycle. Of course, real progress on any of those 17 goals agreed in New York, be it climate change or food security, is predicated upon the international community's ability to secure appropriate levels of funding. This, as many of you will know, was the subject discussed last July 2015 during the Addis Ababa conference, which preceded the New York summit. Again, I think, turning this into figures, I think that the figure suggested is about 4.6 trillion per annum. Then you look at the total amount of pledged development aid for over a period of time, and the argument, there's a moderate argument that suggests you should use this money to trigger money, as it were, to leverage money from a private sector that it is assumed will be able to be brought on side for the costings, for the funding that is necessary. And then you ask the question, will this participation, if you like, from the private sector be within a new paradigm that they have accepted for themselves of sustainability and so on? And then the pessimist will immediately remind me of the outstanding Ecuador case and the fines that are unpaid and so forth. But I think one has to try to move on and say, yes, maybe it is possible that such a conversion will take place as will enable such a leverage to be a meaningful suggestion. As we look at new ways of financing development, I strongly believe that it is imperative that we keep the issue of debt at the centre of our discussions. Indeed, the unsustainable debt position of so many countries, rich and poor, gravely undermines their capacity to plan and execute long-term sustainable development programs. No serious or plausible agreement on development can ignore debt management issues, and more particularly may I suggest the central question of the role of the state and its financial capacity. In that report, the Addis Ababa Conference, in that respect, the Addis Ababa Conference did not dissipate the real concerns that exist in relation to a possible over-reliance on the private sector rather than the state. And this is not me suggesting that there is an inherent necessary opposition between the two. It's simply saying that we are coming out of a period in which the role of the state has been diminished, and in which there are suggestions that you can, in fact, evolve towards meeting the needs that we have through existing models. I have to say, at my age and in my life as an academic as well, I think it is appalling that we have such a reluctance to have innovative thinking of a theoretical kind that can bring us to a new place on these connections. I think that I had the honour, I've been asked to address the 10th UNCTAD Debt Management Conference in Geneva last November, as I have said. I suggested then that each state should be given a mandate to ensure, as I put it, that core social goods are established as a matter of the first order of economic priority, and that the international institutional system should support such a prioritisation. And this gives you, if you like, involvement in the countries towards which much of our discussion is directed. It gives you participation. But of course, in countries like our own, it offers you social cohesion, so desperately needed, not just in Ireland and the European Union, but in so many countries. I mentioned that on that occasion the outrageous example whereby countries dealing with the consequences of the Ebola crisis, striving to ensure the delivery of such basic health services as would prevent a recurrence of the disease, were being asked to give precedence to the servicing of their debt. In fact, they were servicing the accumulated interest on the debt. And of course, there was, I think, a move to really give relief to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the Central African Republic. Of course, in the latter, life expectancy is 50 years. The Sustainable Development Goals have quite a radical potential, precisely in that they provide a framework that might encourage governments to establish a social floor in the years ahead. This is a concept that has relevance, I have suggested, for both richer and poorer countries, and one which I believe could be very productively integrated to the advocacy of NGOs operating both here in Ireland and abroad, offering, as I have said, sustainable development in Africa, social cohesion in the European Union. Dear friends, the scale of the change required in both policy and mindset could cause many to feel overwhelmed or even powerless. The new agreement is global in its reach and in its implications, leaving us with the challenge of delivering a global consciousness and globally responsible actions. Yet I believe that is precisely the scale and ambition of the 2030 agenda that should serve to inspire us. We shouldn't be hesitant in saying deep change is needed. These new goals and targets cannot be met by simply continuing as we are now. And it is an appropriate use of the extended social media to be making this case, to get past the blocks that increasing monopolization and media ownership is likely to offer. And when I spoke to you in January of last year, at the launch of the European Year for Development, I highlighted the great opportunities that were associated with the then emerging global consensus on sustainable development, now that has been turned into the Sustainable Development Goals. Opportunities to depart from biased practices and to deliver a new architecture of global decision-making institutions, based not on raw power, derived from a narrow theory of interests, but on democratic mandates. Opportunities also that were there to examine the theoretical foundations of our development policy. Opportunities to rethink the role of the state and of citizens and of non-governmental organisations. I've been thinking more about this as well in relation to the discussion that is taking place on what is often considered the institutional gap in some developing countries. There are 28 countries, for example, as you will see in the UK report, which do not report on poverty in a 10-year period. There are another 27 that have one indicator, and so forth. There's a real issue in relation to the gathering of data. But I think there are ways of getting past this, and that is where I think we can really look at doing our work in a new way. What I meant when I mentioned about a theory of interest, I have grown up in a system in which regularly I have seen the theory of interest advanced as a kind of defeat of what is called normative theory, as once again as if these were dichotomous concepts, which is nonsense, and it is really poor scholarship and poor work, and it's very, very, very shabby when people don't make the exercise to understand these false dichotomies. But if I might start with how we might deal with this issue of achieving global consciousness, I suggest that citizen literacy is the necessary substructure to any advocacy of a nature that would foster compliance on the part of governments. This requires a sustained investment in the ability of all citizens to understand and participate effectively in the accountability process. Communicating the entire Sustainable Development Agenda, its goals and targets, in clear and simple language to the widest possible audience is therefore a crucial first step. And indeed it is one of our NGOs have already firmly firmly undertaken. May I take this opportunity to congratulate Dóchas members on their actions during the European Year for Development, throughout which you creatively highlighted the progress already achieved in the Millennium Development Goals, and also where they failed. Perhaps in relation to extreme poverty, I think, for example, of indigenous communities and some minorities in different parts of the map, taking out the map of the Millennium Development Goals and looking at what will replace it. Through initiatives such as the World's Best News, or your slogan, "It's not about what we give, but how we live," you have drawn attention to the power of citizen action and the wealth of innovative ideas that are already in existence. That was making an important contribution to the fight against cynicism, pessimism, inaction, or the suggestion there is nothing really we can do. I've no doubt that you will find new and equally creative ways to continue to engage Irish citizens and policymakers throughout the entire implementation phase of Agenda 2030. Indeed, Dóchas member organisations, and there are many, are very well placed to make a direct contribution to the implementation of the new goals. First and foremost, through what constitutes the core of your activities, namely your actions on the ground. You play a critical role, together with Irish Aid, in empowering some of the world's most vulnerable communities to set their own path for prosperity and flourishing. I think, too, you are reporting on another issue, which is important, the notions that you can explain the absence of adequate institutions in some of the developing countries through some model of institutional deficit. When in fact, if we are to take the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets and locate them in the experience of the people of the ground and through the prism of their culture, they will be able, in fact, to develop mechanisms that will look culturally diverse. It is a case, the notion, for example, that there is something that they are missing that we have. Many of our institutions are singularly ineffective at delivering policy. So therefore, we must stop this notion of there being something that we have, a single model that somehow or another can be transplanted. I was often weep to think that for example, that the discipline of anthropology was so often used during the colonization period to explain people's inferiority, but it is so rarely used now to suggest the inadequacy of policies that are imposed on cultural settings that are diverse, and therefore people then affecting astonishment at the failure of things not turning out exactly as they had indicated they might be. I think that your work involves you being able to deal effectively with the most, not just with the most dramatic consequences of extreme poverty, while never losing sight of the wide-ranging policy, institutional, but also the intellectual challenge that is necessary for global sustainable development to become a reality. I think that is very important, and that the challenge for our NGOs is therefore, it's both a practical and an intellectual one. And really, we have to get over this notion about it. If we say that everyone must understand these issues, we must put an end to the notion that there is some complexity involved, that it is beyond our normal ken. Or the suggestion, for example, that people can think with their heart and feel with compassion on issues such as development. But that when it comes to international financial flows, this is something that a higher level of mind understands. The fact is this has to end, and it will only end when people, in fact, exchange information, but also have the courage to say as well, much of this is hocus, that it is in fact, this just doesn't stand up to empirical tests. It is a no, you can draw your own moral consequences. I'm not dictating them. If you say, for example, that as I said 15 years ago, that foreign direct investment flows were half what was spent on development. And today, the foreign direct investment without scrutiny and often without transparency and involving deleterious taxation implications is 5 times what is spent. So therefore, you can say, therefore, those who say as well, you should get on with what you can. And you should, in fact, deal with only who you can convert to their minimal adjustment. Yes, if that is what you want to do, but please don't say it is a sufficient response to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or neither should it satisfy many young people who are young scholars, young students, simply human beings who want to live in a different world. We simply must never allow ourselves to forget that the unresolved issues of global poverty, food insecurity, desertification, unsustainable levels of debt, distorted trade, they are the legacy of paradigms of thought that have failed and continue to fail us as a global community. And it is a big issue. The big moral issue is, even as we prepare for Istanbul, as those who say we can achieve all of this by adjustment within the existing model. That's what we have to discuss. It is not only our institutions that require more integration, but our mode of thinking. There is an urgent need in particular for, as I've said, new theoretical work, new thinking grounded as well in a reconciliation between economy, ethics, and ecology. I think that it is very interesting. I say this as somebody who had a background in economics myself, and it is when economics is returned to within the cultural frame as an instrument for achieving purposes that can be explained to the people in general that you will get real change. And our NGO should seek new ways of supporting long-term thinking and responsible environmentalism globally and locally. Equally importantly, our common development goals must be located, may I suggest, as I've said already, within the context of our different cultures. They must allow for a considered anthropological sensitivity to the communities in which and for which policies are being implemented. For example, it simply isn't good practice to continue to say that you're going to have a set of boxes which you tick as to how people are performing with a particular instrument that you're using for development. They are imperfect, with imperfect materials, coming to many things new. But much, much more important, there is an intuitive wisdom located in their culture, which in fact, when the short-term pragmatic, short-term proposal is located within it, can bring new creative institutional forms and suggestions and plots and plans into it. And if there's any evidence of that, it is in what we know of the work of women in Africa. Placing these universal targets and aims within a framework of cultural diversity is, I firmly believe, one of the key issues of the future and one that should not be avoided. With this in mind, may I then, finally, in summary, offer a few thoughts of some of the ways in which our Irish NGOs can contribute to advancing the new agenda for global sustainable development. Firstly, there are, I believe, new possibilities for advocacy. The new global goals provide a clear mandate, but also the tools for NGOs to go beyond the provision of services and achieve their ambition to give voice to the voiceless by supporting communities who demand participation and accountability. Moving beyond the extremes of the neoliberal moment and its socially defective philosophy, when civil society was regarded as a substitute for an inefficient state, or even at times used as a tool in a wider ideological drive to undermine the state, it is important, I believe, that any future advocacy recognises the crucial role of the state in responding to the needs of the most vulnerable. NGOs must work alongside state services, not serve as a substitute for those basic services. Any advocacy embracing the new paradigm for development, Vote New York, should also, of course, start at home. The United Nations Summit Outcome Document, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, calls on each member state to develop its own national strategy on the global goals and to, I quote, conduct regular and inclusive reviews of progress at the national and subnational level. This is significant as it means that Ireland's contribution to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals is not confined to our aid programme or our foreign policy. Our Irish NGOs must contribute to encouraging policies that can deliver the global goals for all those living in Ireland and across all the areas sustained by sustainable development. This requires, as I know you're aware, the articulation of an ambitious and widely shared vision for a sustainable Ireland, indicating how all state bodies will work towards the achievement of the global goals, be it the eradication of poverty and gender violence, the support of smallholder agriculture, or the delivery of appropriate health and education services, and how they will do so alongside the private and voluntary sectors. I have to say, I don't think these issues surface very much in what I have read of the media descriptions of the negotiations for the formation of the government, but I remain hopeful. In short, the first step towards the achievement of the new Sustainable Development Goals in Ireland demands the articulation of a standalone national strategy on sustainable development, integrating the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda into clear national priorities, action plans, allocated responsibilities, and published budgets. The collection of data is, as many commentators have noted, another important dimension of any effective advocacy, data that can then be made available to the legislative and decision-making process. To eradicate poverty and to tackle inequalities, we need to know who is living in poverty and where, what are their basic needs, and in what way proposed policies are likely to affect them. Poverty proofing. This holds true both domestically and internationally. And as I've said already, the location of extreme poverty has shifted. And I would encourage all Dóchas members to actively engage in the ongoing big data drive, to collect detailed data on the communities you work with, and to add your information to the rapidly growing global knowledge that can provide the scaffolding for future solutions to current global problems. And also, I think it's going to be very, very important for you to be able to say, we are doing this as, if you like, the socially responsible empiricists, rather than the partial empiricists who are hiding part of the problem from us. Secondly, there is an importance of citizen literacy in issues of political economy. If I may go back with a slightly different focus on my point on citizen literacy, I believe that it is important that such literacy includes a strong awareness of political economy issues. Domestic political debates and processes are not separable from the issues of development and climate at hand. The notion of global citizenship, if it is ever to gain substance, requires the strategic organisation and informed participation of our citizens into discourse and decision-making at the national and local levels too. And as for NGOs, they should be encouraged to go beyond their current situation, where their advocacy is at times tolerated within a particular mindset and ideological status quo. So as to must move to inspire people to be able to critically engage with and challenge, where appropriate, policies and structures. In other words, political economy should, in my view, be a core part of our NGOs' knowledge and skills, enabling them to grasp and explain power dynamics and the increasing inequality throughout our world in the division of wealth and resources. It is important that as many NGO workers as possible do not just understand political economy, but are also able to teach it. And it is teachable. They should, for example, be able to explain how the global infrastructure of commodity trading undermines the fundamental objective of food security, of how the current international taxation agreements that you've heard me speak about serve the interests of a limited number of multinational corporations while depriving poorer countries of vital revenues. Spragan agus cuireann na spricna forbartha mar sin dúin sin a dhéanamh. Thirdly, finally, we must recognise that the nature of citizen participation has already started to change throughout the world. Many of you, I know, will have built up a remarkable and admirable track record in delivering services for those overlooked by the states they live in. Indeed, when I look at the failures, the parts of the MDGs that didn't work, they are heavily located with indigenous populations. But your ability to reach out and to serve the most marginalised communities is your very lifeblood. But the new framework for sustainable development encourages us to go even further and to examine critically our own behaviour and lifestyles. It is clear that current patterns of consumption and production lie at the root of the environmental crisis we face, and these cannot be addressed without confronting the underlying challenge of achieving fair and sustainable mechanisms of trade, consumption, and production. Transparency and accountability in the production and supply chains are essential in this regard, as are concerted programmes of public education and at all levels. I have thought what I have been speaking about very much as moving towards what I call a culture of sufficiency. It is a belief in a civilization of sufficiency, in which the move in the history of a people as one moves is very significant, from the time at which you move beyond survival to sufficiency and flourishing, to unquestioned consumption, to where insatiable consumption becomes, if you like, an automatically accepted principle of economic growth, which is in turn unquestioned. I believe that I think that the new framework for sustainable development must challenge us to do all of this. And I think that governments and civil society can no longer be satisfied with simply applying earlier dominant models of policy. Nor can they sustain current patterns of living, producing, trading, and extracting natural resources. Now, I have great sympathy for what is being achieved by many people at the policy level. I'm simply asking, and I'm asking with humility, for the right for this fundamental challenging of the theoretical models to be taken seriously. It has happened at other periods of intellectual history. And what is astonishing to me, I have to say, when I look at the history of intellectual thought, how paradigms could shift in physics, but yet at the same time, paradigms cannot even be challenged, not to speak of being replaced, in relation to models of decision-making that affect the lives of so many people. That is why your work must be ensuring that the achievement of the goals will be a transformational achievement. I think that by adopting the new set of transformational global goals, we've given ourselves a mandate to craft a reflective and holistic vision for development and social progress. It will give us healthier societies. It will give us happier societies. It will give us more fulfillment in lives lived personally and socially. And we have a historic opportunity to lay the foundations for a new model for human flourishing and social harmony. One that is shared between all those who dwell on this planet, and one that is shared too between this generation who have made up their mind to act, who I hope will go on to turn words into action, and that generation that is yet to come. So we must commit today, together, to make this promise thrive and bloom. And thank you very much for listening to me, for inviting me to speak at your conference. Garamila Mahakid.